for indulging me in a quick chat. I appreciate that. But as I mentioned, of course, I never want to keep you all evening for education. Let's just talk for a moment about these classes that we've been doing. So we're in the third of our sort of spotlight series on the villages of Burgundy. Tonight, we're going to be discussing Chambolle-Musigny. We talked recently about Maurice Saint-Denis, and we talked about Gevrey-Chambertin. So we'll talk about the differences in some of these regions that we're seeing today, of course, the styles of wine, the producers. We're going to do a quick review on Burgundy. I'm going to keep it brief because we have so much to talk about. If you joined our other classes, Gevrey-Chambertin has 9 Grand Cru vineyards, so we didn't get an opportunity to talk about the Premier Cru vineyards as much. That will be a little bit different today, which I'm excited about. But let's just orient ourselves for a moment. And as everybody knows, please just take yourself off mute. If you want to ask a question, use the chat box to ask questions or to engage with your community that's here on the call as well. So don't be shy. We're all here as friends. So we're looking at the village of Chambolle-Musigny from the east. So we're essentially looking west here. We're on the eastern side of the village looking west. And I think this is a great photo. It shows how this is a tiny village with a very outside reputation. I mean, look at the size of this village. You can see the orientation of the vineyards here and how some are situated more on slopes than some others, which I think is really great. And you can see, really importantly, we talk about the Côte all the time, right? This slope where we have this sort of almost unbroken chain of vineyards that runs from the northern Côte d'Ivoire to the southern Côte de Beaune that we talk about all the time. But we don't always talk about these combes that sort of run not parallel, but they intersect with the Côte. And you really get a great picture of this comb that we have here that helped funnel down some of this cooler air, which is one of the reasons we might talk about the wines of Chambolle-Musigny as being really fresh and delicate by comparison to some of the other villages in the Côte d'Ivoire or even in the Côte d'Or, the Côte de Beaune, which we'll talk about later. And then we also see that because this comb was probably created by maybe an ancient river or kind of glacial flood sort of that came through this area, we know that there's sort of the cone dejection, which you'll hear about too, which is this sort of alluvial fan of stones and runoff that do come down through this area. And sometimes this sort of alluvial runoff reaches further down to the flatter parts of vineyards, but because it's there and offers really great drainage, these vineyards can still produce really fantastic wine. So there's a very small number of producers here, which we'll talk about. The most important, of course. Why do we want to talk about producers? Because there's expensive Burgundy and there's very expensive Burgundy, right? Especially if you want to drink something that's not just at the regional level. If you want to drink something from the Côte d'Or, we're talking about expensive and very expensive, usually. And then we want to be able to hedge our bets with the money that we spend. Many of these plots of land are so incredibly tiny that it drives up the market price. A lot of the price of Burgundy is driven up in the secondary market because the production is just so minuscule. It's difficult to make. The producers care intensely about the quality of wine that they put out with their name on it too. So they do a lot of things that lower yield, that cost a lot of money, and this all increases the price of the wines. So anyways, getting ahead of myself, I start thinking about other things that are really fun. This is the vineyard of, you can see Fusa, the Premier Cru, Fusalot, and we'll work on the pronunciation of things, which is always fun. And then across the road, you have a really great village or village level vineyard. It's not a Premier Cru, just classified as Chambolle, but it's called Le Pas-Chat, the cat's football. So these are both great areas to look for as well. So let's spotlight in. Where are we? We're in France. We're here in Burgundy. It's a pretty small area when you look at it. We're talking about the northern section of the Côte d'Or, the Golden Slope, which is the Côte d'Ivoire. And we're talking about a single village. So we're going to be talking about Chambolle-Musigny tonight. A lot of the history of Burgundy, which is so fascinating, will tie into what makes this village so special, along with its Grand Cru and Premier Cru vineyard, right? So we can see the kind of the map of the Côte here. We have the village of Chambolle-Musigny. And I just want to point out, because I think it always helps to just sort of orient ourselves to what we're looking at. So the purple is the Grand Cru vineyard. So there's 33 Grand Cru vineyards that are classified in Burgundy. They're not all located in the Côte. We do have some located further south in the Côte, which is not on this map. But you can see that there's kind of like almost 2 or 3 sort of unbroken chunks, right, of like Grand Cru vineyards. So we have the vineyards, the Grand Crus of Gevrey-Chambertin, of which there are 9. We have the Grand Cru vineyards of Maurice-Saint-Denis. Gevrey-Chambertin runs into Maurice-Saint-Denis. When it comes to the Grand Cru vineyard, you have La Trissière that runs directly into Clos-Saint-Denis. And then you have down here, Bonne, which is a Grand Cru vineyard that's shared between Chambolle and Moray. So you have this sort of unbroken chain of Grand Cru vineyards, right? And then you see we just have Premier Cru vineyards. And then it starts again here south of Chambolle with the village of, the vineyard, the Grand Cru vineyard of Musigny, and that runs directly into Rougeot. So what's really unique about this particular village is that the Grand Cru vineyards are not adjacent to each other. They're actually in 2 separate vineyards on opposite sides of the village itself. So here we see a map of the vineyard of the village of Chambolle-Musigny. We won't be talking about Rougeot, although it is on this map, or Clos de Rougeot. We're not going to be discussing that village in this particular class, but you can see that Musigny does abut Clos de Rougeot. And we talk all the time about how the quality of the Clos de Rougeot Grand Cru is so variable. Look at the size, like of course it is, right? Look at the size of Musigny, which is this area here, compared to Clos de Rougeot. Look at the size of Bonne compared to Clos de Rougeot. So you can really see why the quality of Clos de Rougeot is so variable, because of the sheer size. It's not all concentrated on a specific type of soil or a specific part of the hill, and it has a lot of producers. If we zoom in a little bit more, you can see the individual vineyard holdings. We're going to be looking at this, but Musigny itself is 1 Grand Cru, but essentially there's 3 parts of it. So there's Les Petites Musigny, which is owned entirely by 1 producer. The best part, known as Les Musigny, or sometimes Grand Musigny, both of those names apply, owned by mostly 1 producer. And then we also have an area known as the Côme d'Orvaux. And the Côme d'Orvaux is on the southern side of Les Petites Musigny, is owned entirely by Jacques Prieur. So then you can also see their best Premier Cru, Les Amoureuses, which is considered to be by most on par with Grand Cru level wines as well. When you're saying like Premier Cru and Grand Cru and vineyard and village, sometimes my words run into each other and I mix them up. So I'll try to correct myself, but please just take it a little bit easy on me, because sometimes I realize that I'm like, oh, I meant to say village and I said vineyard. I meant to say Grand, I said Premier. So I'll try to correct myself, but I appreciate your patience. So let's just talk very briefly about the organization of the appellation. We have the regional Bourgogne level wines. These can come from anywhere. They're either Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, unless the wine says Aligoté, Bourgogne Aligoté, meaning it's from the Aligoté grape. The grape can come from anywhere in Burgundy and be blended together. But there are high-level producers that make really great regional level Bourgogne wine. So this is a great example. Domaine Ferrier, not located in Chambolle, but his Bourgogne is usually old vine, and it'd be really fantastic as well. Now, village, this is where we start seeing an individual name of a village on the label. So today we're talking about Chambolle-Musigny, right? So you might see Chambolle-Musigny by itself, meaning the grapes are coming from any vineyard that's associated with Chambolle-Musigny, the village, and blended together to make a village level wine. You might also see the name of the village, Chambolle-Musigny, with the name of a lieu-dit, which is a single named plot of land that, almost every parcel of land in Burgundy is named. There are 1,247 climats just in the Côte d'Or alone that are classified by UNESCO as World Heritage Sites. So really every parcel of land is named. The climats are what are considered really to be like the Grand Crus, the Première Crus, and then the lieu-dits tend to be these named vineyards that are associated with the village, but are not necessarily classified at the higher Première Cru or Grand Cru level. A lot of the reason that the lieu-dit names exist is actually for taxation purposes. So it's more of like kind of a political and administrative name, but they've been adopted because the vineyards are there as well by producers to use on the labels. So you might see a single lieu-dit located on a village level wine. Then you have Première Cru. Now, remember, because we'll talk about this a lot, you'll see two styles of Première Crus coming from these individual villages. So you'll see the name of the village, you'll see Chambolle-Musigny, and then you might only see the term Première Cru or 1ER Cru. That's meaning that the producer has several holdings in different Première Cru vineyards. And we're going to look at a map in a moment, so this is going to make more sense. And then they blended those different plots in multiple Première Cru vineyards together, and they're releasing it as a village level Première Cru. So essentially, when you're thinking about how we classify things in Burgundy, the level of classification that we put on the label is always the lowest denomination of what's in the actual bottle itself. So for example, maybe you're using 95% of your fruit from Les Amoureux, the Première Cru in Chambolle-Musigny. But if you decide to use 5% of fruit from Fremieres, which is a village level vineyard, you would now have to declassify your wine to just Chambolle-Musigny, if it makes sense. You can also see a Première Cru wine coming from the village with a single vineyard on it. And then of course we have the top level, 2% of all the wines, the Grand Cru, of which tonight we'll be talking about Domaine and Musigny. So how did things get this way? We kind of know a lot of the answers. We've talked about Burgundy quite a bit. If you have not seen the Burgundy Basics video that we have, I sent a link today with the link for class tonight, and that's a recording. If you didn't get a chance to watch it, that recording will be available. So you can just click on that link at any time, tomorrow, next week, 6 months, and that should still work for you to review that. So we know that we have wine production happening here back to 200 AD. We have the Roman Empire that came into this area, but it was really these sort of Christian monasteries, these monks, the Benedictines, the Cistercians. They were incredibly contemplative. They really enjoyed making wine. They recorded everything that they did, really importantly. They worked in these vineyards, and they started to develop the notion of terroir that we hold so dear in Burgundy today, right? Understanding that different plots of land based on where they were kind of on the hillside, or in relation to north to south, of course, in relation to the village, tended to yield different styles of wine, even if they were right next to each other, right? Why is Les Fruits classified as Première Cru when just across the road on a slightly lower slope, right, is classified as just village level? So they started to really see these nuances, the minutiae of these different plots of land. And they especially noticed it because in Burgundy, we really are talking about two grape varieties. Now we have more than just two. They had more than just two back then as well. But these are really, we think that Pinot Noir has existed for at least 2,000 years in this area. So we really had the opportunity to see through the lens of this grape how terroir affected the wine. Now, fast forward, we have the French Revolution in 1789. Napoleon, just after this time, what happened during the revolution is a lot of the vineyard land belonged to royalty, belonged to the church. The vineyard land was seized. It was given to the local people that lived in the region. He also, around the same time period, ended the practice of primogeniture. So this was the idea that the firstborn son would inherit the entire family wealth. And in a place like Burgundy, the family wealth was often the vineyard and the land, the property that was owned, right? The real estate, the Burgundy real estate. Now, this really lasted for about 100 years, if not more. And so what ended up happening was that the vineyard land became continuously fragmented into private ownership in Burgundy. So the vineyard would have multiple owners, oftentimes from the same family. If you think about how many times you see different names on a label of wine that are not made by the same producer in Burgundy, right? Because the surname can be so common. Children branch off from their parents' winery to start their own winery under their first name, but the same last name, and so forth. So we do see a lot of this fragmentation. We see these names repeated oftentimes as well. Now, once we have all of these vineyard owners who own these small plots of land, what happens? They don't have enough grapes, enough vines to make a commercially viable product, right? They don't have enough grape to just make wine and live off of that income. So a lot of these smaller growers began selling their grape to larger, what we call negociants, or larger wineries who would purchase grapes from smaller growers and then make the wine under their own label. So a lot of these negociants came to being in the 1800s. We'll talk about Favelet, we'll talk about Drouhin today. Of course, Drouhin's one of the best negociants that you'll find. Jadot is really important. And many of these negociants, though they also purchase grapes, many of them own their own vines and their own vineyards as well. So, or their own part of vineyards. In the 1930s, we see producers who decide that they want to take back their grapes and begin Domaine bottling their wine. So we see the rise of Domaine bottling in the 1930s. Now, what else makes, and these producers are important too. Sorry, I'm backtracking, but we talk a lot about the terroir, of course. Where are you? We tend to see the Grand Cru in the mid slope where the drainage is best, the sunlight's the most concentrated. You're not on the flat land that are closer to the village, and you're not close enough to the forest that are too cool. So usually we see a lot of these sort of Grand Cru vineyards in the mid slope, right? We see Premier Cru usually at the top slope, above the Grand Crus and below the Grand Crus, and then more of the village and regional level vineyards down below. So what makes it so important, the idea of domain bottling, we think about the human element in Burgundy, right? The idea that because I talked about that nepotism already, those family names that have been in Burgundy for such an intensely long time, each generation has really done a lot. Like Burgundy is expensive, but the producers here do not rest on their laurels for the most part. They are continuing to evolve. They are getting better in the vineyard. They are making better wines than ever before. Many of the winemakers today, whereas their grandparents probably would have never visited Italy or Spain or Russian River Valley or South Africa, many of these producers today are visiting these places. They're working harvest elsewhere. Talk about Drouhin and Oregon here in a second too, if we should get into that conversation. But we've been passing down this accrued knowledge from family member to family member for generations in Burgundy about how to work these individual parcels of land that have sometimes been in the family for a century or 50 years or however long it's been for each individual. Now you can purchase and sell your vineyard or your plot of vineyard land in Burgundy. We'll talk about this too. So the climate, the soil, the climate, the exposure, we kind of mentioned the exposure here. The soil of Burgundy, although each vineyard sort of has its own character, we talk primarily about limestone, which gives a lot of the bones of the soil, the kind of electricity that we get the grace of Burgundy. And then we have these clay soils as well. And clay is really great for Chardonnay, and it gives the wine this like kind of beautiful weight and depth as well. So we really have this great mix of this limestone and clay soil that we call marl, right? We have this golden slope that's been pushed up by the fault line. The best vineyards are primarily southeast in exposure. So we do have some vineyards that face other directions, but a lot of the Grand Crus face southeast. This allows for the best concentration, meaning the best ripening. And when we started classifying many of the vineyards in France, and we thought about in each region what vineyards and what areas were the best, they were usually the areas where grapes were able to get fully ripe in every vintage, right? So we think about that concept as well, which might be changing today with global warming. We do have cold winters. There's a lot of frost. There's a lot of hail because of those cones of sort of like what we saw at the beginning in that first picture, the intro slide. Because of those cones, we do sometimes have these weather patterns that bring inclement weather, which can be really unfortunate as well. This inclement weather is worse in some areas of Burgundy than others. It tends to be a little bit worse in the Côte du Beaune than in the Côte Nuit because the cones are a little bit smaller. So maybe not as much of this bad weather comes through that way. All right, fun stuff. So we're talking about Chambolle. When did Chambolle become Chambolle-Musigny, right? Now, in terms of size, we're much smaller than Gevrey-Chambertin. We're a little bit bigger than Maurice Saint-Denis, but it's very compact, and we have very few producers in Chambolle-Musigny as well. We have an extreme overall standard of high quality, but there is a little bit of a split personality. Like we're going to talk in a second about the overall style of Chambolle-Musigny wines of the village. But when we look at where the village is and how the vineyards are split on either side of that village, we can understand that the vineyards that are closer to Maurice Saint-Denis actually lie on the same sort of rock strata as Gevrey-Chambertin and Maurice Saint-Denis. When we go south of the village, we have a different style of limestone over here. We tend to have wines in the south that are really focused on finesse and elegance and floral components, where in the north we have the same Chambolle aromatics, but we do oftentimes have more power in Bon Mar and in the surrounding Premier Crus as well. So we have this kind of split personality. It's located nestled within that combe, as we could see there. I couldn't remember the name earlier, but the Combe des Chamboufs. And its most famous vineyard, which is Musigny, was appended to the village in 1882. And we mentioned this a lot, but why did we decide to do this? Gevrey was the first to append the name of its most famous vineyard, which was Chambertin, in the 1700s. And the idea behind this is, you know, a lot of people understand that drink wine, the concept of the Grand Crus, but they might not be aware that there are other vineyards within that village that produce wines that might be in a similar style. They might not be the same epitome of quality. They might not be the same complexity and grace as the Grand Cru vineyard, the best plots of land, the ones that both grow the best grapes, that make the best wines, and usually resultingly have the best producers as well, right? Again, human element. But this allows somebody to understand that producers who are making wine in the village of Chambolle-Musigny might make a style similar to producers who are making wine in the Grand Cru of Musigny. I hope that makes sense. So it's really helpful for both the consumer and also for the producers of the village as well. Now, this might be confusing. You might hear somebody say, I had the best Musigny last night, and you might push them for a little bit more information to find out that maybe they had a village level Chambolle-Musigny. So it is important to think about the distinction between the village Chambolle-Musigny and the vineyard Musigny, because they are not the same thing. So this is the only, the vineyard of Musigny is the only vineyard in the Côte that can produce a Grand Cru white or red wine. At the village and the Premier Cru level in Chambolle, you can only produce red wine. So you're not going to find a Chambolle-Musigny white. You're not going to find a Chambolle-Musigny Premier Cru white, but you will find from a single producer a Musigny Grand Cru Blanc coming from Chardonnay. Everything else that you find with the name of the village or the name of the Grand Cru Musigny or the Grand Cru Bonnes will be red wine from Pinot Noir. So these wines are the epitome of grace in Burgundy. They're charming, they're sensual, they're ethereal. They're known for their very sensuous fruit, but with a sense of weightlessness in terms of their texture. They do tend to be light in both color and structure. This has a lot to do with, especially south of the village, when we talk about Musigny and the surrounding vineyard, the Premier Cru and village vineyards that we find surrounding the Grand Cru of Musigny. They have a higher portion of limestone. So this causes a mild chlorosis in the vine. The leaves themselves tend to be a paler green. This translates to lighter colored wine. There tends to be a much higher emphasis on the aroma, the fragrance, the complexity of the fruit and the flower notes in the wine than essentially power on the palate. So a lot of people like to, sort of kind of say these wines tend to be more feminine of their counterparts. When we talk about the 3 villages that we're discussing tonight and that we previously did in class, out of Gevrey-Chambertin is the firmest in terms of its structure. Maurice Saint-Denis is a little bit less firm than Gevrey, but not quite as soft as Chambolle. So it's the lightest of these 3 vineyards typically. And I don't want us to confuse lightness when we talk about kind of the airy palette and the kind of beautiful floral aromas. I don't want to confuse lightness with thinking that the wines are not impactful, because that's certainly not true. What they don't have in overt power on the palate, they really make up for in terms of their aroma. These are the types of wines, like you put it to your nose and you're like, I don't even want to take a drink. I just want to smell this wine. It is like a perfume. It is like something that smells really fantastic. As we mentioned before, when we're closer to Maurice Saint-Denis, there's a little bit of a wilder feeling to the wine. They reflect that sort of that rock substratum that we talked about, the Comblanchian limestone that we see all the way from Gevrey through Maurice and then down into the northern part of Chambolle. We have 2 Grand Crus equaling a total of 24 hectares. So Bonnes in the north, Musigny in the south, split by the village. We have 24 Premier Crus covering a total of 61 hectares. Now, can we generalize anything in Burgundy? No, not really. But there's so much to know. And this is one of the things that make Burgundy so endlessly fascinating. And it took me a long time to realize that as a student of wine, you really have to approach Burgundy with an excitement about discovery. You'll never know everything. You'll never remember everything that you've already once learned. You'll never be able to walk into a shop and know everything about every Burgundy wine in there. Even if you've learned it before, you've had the wine. But it's really about that journey of exploration that can be really fun. So we can't necessarily generalize, but we do have to find a way to compartmentalize, right? And when I say we can't generalize, I'm going to generalize right now. I'm going to say, when it comes to the Premier Crus, we can kind of classify or think of the top Premier Crus as kind of 3 different categories of style. Now, when I say we can't generalize, I mean that this is not the law, right? We have producers who might make wine in a more voluptuous style. We might have part of a vineyard that's been replanted and has younger vines. We might have a different clone or a different orientation of the road within these individual Premier Crus. So certainly they can both share characteristics and similarities between these ones that I'm saying are different, or based on the style of or the spot or how something is made, one of these producer styles of wine coming from one of these Premier Crus might be more similar to an opposite or polar Premier Cru, if that makes sense. So the three kind of stylistic categories are we have these sort of charming, these plush and round, refined wines. This is epitomized by Les Charmes. You see the Charme vineyard means charming. Many places in Burgundy, right? We talk about Charme in Marceau. We know that there is a Charme in Chambertin and Gevrey, right? We talk about these sort of kind of beautiful and exactly what they mean, charming styles. They tend to be approachable for Burgundy wines in their youth for these Premier Cru wines. You also see Gruanchet, Châteaulots, Combotes. We're going to talk about Combotes. Do not mistake it for Combotes in Gevrey Chambertin. Again, you'll see a lot of these vineyard names repeated in different villages. So it's always important to not just look at only the village or only the vineyard, or only the designation of Premier Cru, right? So we need to look at some of these other sort of clues that we have on the label of wine. We have a category of wines that tend to be more intensely mineral, muscular. They can be austere in their youth. Many of these Premier Crus, like Le Cras and Fouet, are located closer to Bonne and Maurice Saint-Denis. And then some of them are really in the path of that comb where we see that cooler air coming down. And maybe this is also one of the reasons that in general, Chambolle tends to have this lighter, fresher style. It's because the village is rather small and a lot of it is affected by the cool air. So we don't often talk about diurnal shift in Burgundy, right? You hear that in a lot of places like New World wine regions. We talk about that retaining acidity at night and ripening the grapes during the day. But this is probably happening in the village of Chambolle. So Vieilles, Le Baude, Sentier, and Carrière. We also talk about this mineral, muscular, somewhat austere in their youth category. And then we have these ones that tend to be a little bit closer to Musigny and do oftentimes mirror a lot of the characteristics of Musigny. A striking elegance, perfume, a lot of minerality, but they don't necessarily have a lot of muscle on the palate. I always try to think of things that I can describe, like what do we mean when we say ethereal and airy when it comes to wine? Like, think about like a really fine mousse, or sometimes when you have a champagne whose bubbles are so delicate, you just feel them for a moment and then they're whisked deliciously off of the palate. And you have just enough structure in the wine to really allow the flavors to make contact and express themselves on your palate. So Les Cômes d'Orvaux, which is partially classified as Premier Cru and partially classified as Grand Cru. Les Audois and Les Fuselots, which we saw the sort of right-hand side of that road coming down from the village in the first picture. We have Les Amoureux, the Grand Cru quality Premier Cru. Not a Grand Cru, it's a Premier Cru, but we'll talk more about that. The majority of the Premier Crus are clustered around one or the other of the Grand Crus. And many of the producers that are here do not have enough holdings in each Premier Cru to bottle separate Premier Crus. So as I mentioned earlier, make sure we remember the idea of the two sets of Premier Crus that you'll see in Burgundy. Premier Cru of the village and Premier Cru of an individual vineyard, right? So most producers have just a few rows of vines in these teeny tiny Premier Cru vineyards and will bottle and blend their Premier Crus, and that will be just a Chambolle-Musigny Premier Cru. So keep that in mind. I kind of told you like Beaumar, firmer, Musigny, clustered around Musigny tend to be a little bit lighter. Now, because we have such a proliferation of these sort of really fantastic but small Premier Cru vineyards in Chambolle-Musigny, we don't focus as much on the village lieu-dits, but there are a few that we should certainly mention. It's also important to understand that there are a number of vineyards that are classified as partly Premier Cru and as partly village level. So we'll talk about a little bit of that as well, right? So you can find some of the wines that you might want to look at. It can be really great at the lieu-dits level for the village of Chambolle-Musigny. Les Atettes, which is located close to the main road. John Tardy is one of the most common producers that you'll see bottling this particular wine. I already mentioned earlier, Les Pas de Chat, across the road, the cat football. So it's just a charming name. And, you know, we know that you should never drink wine because of the name on the bottle or because of the label, but I mean, come on. Somebody knew what they were doing when they named this vineyard the cat football. So on a slight slope just across from Grand Cru vineyard, just south, I guess it wouldn't be south. When I look at this map, I think south, but it would actually be just east of the village. If we're moving down this way is east, this way is south. Fremieres, which we'll be talking about today. Fremieres is a pretty sizable vineyard in terms of the village level. Digioia-Royer, which we'll be talking about today. Digioia, they're called. Domaine Loire, bottled wine from here. Louis Remy, Magnin, bottled wine from here. Very well placed. And because it's sizable, you're likely to see a little bit more of it in the market. And then also Les Clos d'Orme, which probably might have merited Grand Crus status as a vineyard, as it's very well situated right down here. These like my little hearts on the map here. So you can see, sorry, my cursor's not working. So you can see right here, the vineyard here where it should probably merit Grand Cru status. You can see that it's adjacent to many of the Grand Crus themselves, but it's just a little bit too low on the slope. But Sylvain Cathard produces a really great example. And these wines are less expensive than the Grand Crus, right? They're less expensive than Musigny or Bonnes. So Les Amoureuses, the most important Grand Cru. Many producers who make Amoureuses price it at the same price or sometimes even higher than they might price their Bonnes if they make wine in Bonnes as well. Oftentimes, they might even serve their Amoureuses after the Bonnes in a lineup. I would think the Bonnes would usually be a little firmer, but they want to end, I guess, on what they consider to be their best wine or the highest note. So it might be called Amoureuses, the lovers, because they talk about the soil sticking to your boots when it thickens in the rain, clinging like these young lovers. We have fantastic, fantastic producers here. So we see you see the vineyard here, and then down here you can see the holdings, some of the holdings of the top producers. So we have Pousse-Dior, we have Meunier, we have Roumier, we have Boguet, which are the most important producers that we'll be talking about today. So they all and others own a small, small piece of this vineyard, and you can see these sort of fractured holdings. So keep this in mind because we're going to see some better vineyard maps too, not just of Amoureuses, but of some of the Grand Crus. So Roumier, we mentioned, Meunier, Groffier, Amiot Cervelle are all here, and Domaine Berthaud, who I think is a really fantastic producer who might not necessarily get enough love either. So Les Crus and Les Fouets, these are located adjacent and almost adjacent to Bonnes. So each time we go to the next slide, I've tried to highlight the area that we're actually going to be talking about on the map here. So you can sort of see where they're at. If you love Burgundy, I might recommend you can get a really great app. I'll send it out tomorrow, the name of it, like Atlas de Bourgogne or something like that for like $10 on your phone, and it can be really great. So historically, this was not considered among the top Grand Crus, even though it is a Grand Cru, but that's probably changed today because of global warming. The style is racy and mineral. It has a lot of personality. Prior to it being a little bit warmer, it might not have ripened quite evenly enough in each year to be as to have as much prestige as it does today. Guillain Barthaud, Roumier, Bouteilleau-Baillet, Patrice Rion are here. This is a vineyard that is classified both as village and as Grand Cru, and you can see that. So you can see, I think you can. So Les Crus and Les Crus. So you can see in the difference in color, here's your Grand Cru section, and this section of the village is actually classified as just as village level. Les Fouets is adjacent to Les Crus, just over here next to Bonmar. So you can imagine it has a lot of that wildness, that suavity, of course, a little bit of that boldness, but it's not quite as dense as something you might get out of the Grand Cru of Bonmar itself. More of a similar rock strata before we hit the village here. Favelet is here, Negociant, Mounier is here, Barthaud is here as well. Guillain Barthaud and Jadot are all located here in this area. And you can see La Croix here that does abut the village itself. So tiny. Les Verrois. So Les Verrois is only 10% classified as Premier Cru, and the rest of the 90% of the vineyard itself is classified at the village level. So Guillain Barthaud is actually, we're going to talk about her a little bit later on when we talk about producers, but this is a monopole of hers. The Premier Cru section, she's the only one that owns these vines. And then Bruno Claire, the really important producer from Marcenay further north, but he makes the village level Les Verrois here as well. Sentier, it's just below Bonmar, where the slope begins to flatten. You see some great producers here like Arlaud, Groffier. Labode as well produces a pretty firm style. You have producers from Gevry that are also coming into the village of Chambolle. They might own plots of land in these individual vineyards, and they're making wine from them. And if you have a producer from Gevry who has grapes in Chambolle and is making wine, that producer might make the wines in a style that's a little bit more similar to what they make in Gevry-Chambertin. So Christian Seraphine is a really great example of that, where his Gevry wines tend to be a little bit more modern. They're picked a little bit later. Sometimes they can be a little bit more on the voluptuous side. And he makes his Les Baudes, Premier Cru from Chambolle, in a similar style to that. Les Lavrots, very, very little seen. The only wine I know of commercially in the market is coming from the Micro Negociant, Olivier Bernstein, but also well situated below Bonmars. But you can see that tiny, right? Verrois, just barely over half of a hectare, under 1 hectare. Les Lavrots, right? Noiro, not even 3 hectares. So you can see how these small holdings oftentimes don't give producers enough grape to bottle a Premier Cru wine out of them. So they will declassify to that village level. We have Arlaud, Sigaud, the favorite of mine, and in Herve, Oudelet Noaillat, coming from Beaune Romani. They're located making wine over here. And also Domaine Drouhin owns vines, but he declassifies the vines into the Premier Cru Chambolle village level. Behind the barn, Derrière-Lagrange, under half a hectare, a very tiny strip. You can see I've highlighted it down here as well. This is just 2 producers, and the occasional negociant might bottle these wines coming from Derrière-Lagrange, so you won't see them very often. Gruanchet, named for a small walnut with a hard shell. Fourier is coming down here. Dujac from Marie Saint-Denis. Digioia-Royer we'll talk about. Guillain Barthaud produced this wine only in 2009. So you might see that. If you see that wine, Gruanchet from Barthaud is pretty special. She only produced it in this single year. We have Grossaille, almost 1.5 hectares, meaning the red currants. There's no major owner in this vineyard itself. And then Digioia-Royer makes the only Domaine version. And these vines were planted in 1935. So that's pretty cool. And also, you think about a lot of the vines, which we haven't mentioned, but I think we'll see this as we start talking about more of the producers. There's a lot of old vine material in Chambolle-Musigny. This could be because of the kind of smaller number of producers that we have that have maybe been able to hold on to their vineyard holdings here as well. Abo Bruns, 1.5 hectares, one of the lower slope Premier Crus, also partially classified as a village level wine. You keep seeing Guillain, right? Guillain Barthaud. So we're going to talk about it, but you keep seeing her name for the Premier Crus because she bottled 9 different Premier Crus. So she is a wonderful resource to be able to taste these different Premier Crus from Chambolle-Musigny next to each other if you can get your hands on them. Carrier, 1/2 hectare, just below the village, used to be the site of a quarry, so the wines are in a little bit of a dip. There was a lot of quarries here on the slopes in Burgundy from the times of yore. Châteauneuf, also in a dip, a little bit like its neighbor, but it doesn't have quite as rich of soil. Barthold is here as well. Acombotes. Please do not confuse Acombotes with the Acombotes Premier Cru in Gevrey-Chambertin, which abuts the Grand Cru of La Trissière and is a fantastic Premier Cru. Unfortunately, this one does not have the same potential of Gevrey-Chambertin. So it's not enough, as I mentioned before, just to notice what the name of the Premier Cru vineyard is, but are you in the right village? And so this is a really great example of that as well. Now, one small part of Au Combat in Chambolle-Musigny is currently in use as a potato patch. So it just kind of shows that the quality of this Premier Cru is not necessarily up to the same standard of quality if somebody would plant potatoes instead of vines as some of the other Premier Crus. However, Guillain Barthold and Fremieres produce really fantastic examples. So we're in Burgundy, so we always know producer over almost everything else, right? I mean, maybe not producer over Grand Cru, although we definitely think that in somewhere like Clos de Vougeot, but we always want to take into account who is the producer, what is the human element, and they can probably do something really great. Frusolot, we saw a little bit of a larger Premier Cru that we see here as well. It's closing in on almost 4 hectares, had the deepest and the richest soils of all of the Premier Crus. So there's another Premier Cru called Les Grands Murs, which is really interesting. Theoretically, it's its own Grand Cru that should be declared under its own name. But Gilbert Fayetigue tried to register his wine from the vines that were coming from Les Grands Murs, and he was instructed to use the Frusolot designation, which is right next to it. So is this because no producer had really tried to recently bottle their Premier Cru Les Grands Murs and they just didn't want to deal with the paperwork? I mean, I don't really know what the suits and the desk people were thinking here, but it technically is its own Premier Cru, so he should have been able to label it as so. But they told him he couldn't, so he uses the Frusolot designation on this particular wine. Now in Burgundy, we always say there are always exceptions, right? And we know this. Le Charme, we mentioned earlier, this is the largest Premier Cru. Been long considered the most desirable Premier Cru after Amourouze, but it's really one of the reasons, and not the only reason, but its visibility in the market is really partly because of its size, right? This is one of the Premier Crus where we have a reasonable amount of wine that comes from it that can come into the market. You know, we think about Guillain and making her 9 different Premier Crus, and that's great. It would be wonderful to line all of them up in a single vintage and try them side by side. But it's probably pretty hard to get your hand on those wines themselves. We mentioned before, Charme does tend to have a lot in common with other Charme vineyards throughout Burgundy, that sort of plump and charming and more rounded style. Charme does have a lot of great growers in the area. So Barthold, Berthaud, which we'll talk about, Parcels coming from Maurice Saint-Denis to make some wine here as well. We also have Les Plantes, just to the north of Les Charmes. Classification tends to be a little bit more on the marginal side. It slips away from Charmes. It goes down a little bit closer to the dip of Combotes. Is that close to the potato patch in Combotes? I'm not sure. They didn't show the potato patch on the vineyard map of Combotes in Chambolle-Musigny. So I'll see if I can find that information, mostly for myself somewhere. Bretagne is here. Amiot Cervelle, who we'll talk about. Jacques Cachot, making wine coming from the area or the Premier Cru vineyard of Le Plante. The last 3 we'll talk about Les Borniques, Chabillot, Les Ardois. These are all close to Amourouzet, especially Les Ardois. It forms the northern flank. Robert Groffier is here. The drainage is not quite as good, which is probably why it's not considered in the same Premier Cru classification, although it is also a Premier Cru as Amourouzet. Domaine Cerveau is making wine in Chabillot, 1.5 hectares, sits just above Amourouzet, also a great location. And then Borniques, you rarely see this. The holdings themselves are so incredibly fragmented, but it is a continuation of the Grand Cru of Musigny as well. Now let's talk about some Grand Crus. All right, Bonnes Mares, the Good Mothers, possibly derivative of marer, to cultivate. We don't know. These are some ideas that we might have. There was an abbey that was founded in this area as well. Bonnes Mares is a Grand Cru that's shared between 2 villages. Now, the lion's share of the vineyard lies within the boundaries of Chambolle-Musigny. So only 1.5 hectares are located in Marie-Saint-Denis, and you can see on this map, this small sliver on the right side of the line here. And the rest of Les Bonnes Mares, over 13 hectares, are all located in the village of Chambolle-Musigny. It has a multiplicity of producers. It has an extremely complex terroir on that Comblanchian limestone strata, but there's also a footpath that divides the vineyard kind of from the southern, kind of the southeastern side to the northwestern side. And it creates this division along these 2 soil types that you really tend to see. So we have this terre rouge that's above the footpath, the terre blanche that's below the footpath, and they do tend to create different styles of wine. So many producers who own plots within the Grand Cru of Bonnes Mares will blend their 2 or multiple plots together within the vineyard. So it's still a Grand Cru level wine because it's all being blended from the same vineyard. But what this does is it actually blends these 2 terroirs together. So Vauguet, his portion is actually located on the more kind of lighter terre blanche style. So we can see, let's look at some maps here, and I'm kind of moving in a little bit closer. So you have Vauguet. So Vauguet on that lower, lighter soil that we talked about, the terre blanche. So it tends to be, because his wine is only on this soil, a lighter expression of Bonnes Mares than you get from a lot of other producers. You can see that Mounier had multiple plots here. You can see Dujac is over here. Roumier is located on mostly the top, the more terre rouge style soil. But he also has, Christophe, a little plot of land over here where you're moving into those terre blanche style of soils, right? Drouhin-Larose is here. Roumier, sorry, that should say Roumier, not Frumier. Beauclair, Bart Groffier, Rougerey, Dujac, Pierre Neigeon, Bruno Claire, Mounier, Berthaud, Lignier. You have a lot of really fantastic producers. Jadot, which is traditionally a negociant, does own his plot, I believe, in both Bonnes Mares and also in Musigny as well. So Bonnes Mares, firmer, richer. We're thinking like 12 to 15 years of that wine being in the bottle for Grand Cru Bonnes Mares before you should touch it. Like, it needs some time to integrate the tannin, the flavor, to develop that aroma. It needs some time to rest in that bottle before you open it. So they say 12 to 15 years minimum for Bonnes Mares. We're in Musigny, the top vineyard of Chambolle-Musigny, right? In 1110, the monks of Citeaux received the land of the vineyard. But for a long time, it was not, or it was never taken over by a single owner or actually enclosed with walls. So it would never close. The vineyard itself was never enclosed in these smaller walls. It's made up of 3 lieu-dits they're all part of the Grand Cru of Musigny. So Les Musigny or Les Grands Musigny, as we mentioned earlier, this is the largest part. Vaugué is the largest owner of plots within Les Musigny or Les Grands Musigny. Petit Musigny is entirely owned by Comte de Georges de Vaugirard. Now we also have this little parcel over here, La Combe d'Orvaux. Now remember, La Combe d'Orvaux is classified partially as Grand Cru, partially as Premier Cru. So this is owned entirely by Jacques Prieur. And I'll take a moment to talk about Jacques Prieur because we're not going to mention him otherwise in the kind of the producers today. But Jacques Prieur owns parcels in many Grand Cru vineyards. He has he's in Montrachet, he's in Chambertin, he's in Musigny, but he has a lot of holdings all up and down the entire Côte. And the wines are not considered quite as high of quality as some of these smaller growers. His style tends to be to pick a little bit later and make riper styles of wine. Now, his portion of the Musigny vineyard was upgraded from Premier Cru to Grand Cru at his urging. I'm not sure how this happened, but he was able to petition for long enough to the INAO, the government that covers wine, NIAO, to say that his portion should be upgraded. So they upgraded it and added it to the Grand Cru of Musigny. So he is the sole owner of that portion of the Grand Cru Musigny vineyard. We tend to describe these wines as sort of an iron fist and a velvet glove. We talk about the sumptuous and rich nature of the fruit, that kind of velvet characteristic, with this exceptional density, but that density is not in, again, palate weight. It's the archetype of elegance for Pinot Noir as well. The upper part of the vineyard is oolitic limestone. The lower part, we have a little bit of that Comblanchian marble. The water has to find its way through the rock. And one of the reasons we might have that proliferation of old vines here in Chambolle-Musigny is because we do have a pretty hard rock strata here. And the vines do really have to dig down in order to establish themselves. So you don't see that in every part of Burgundy. The slope is evident here, but it's not incredibly extreme. Most of the holdings, as you can see here, we're going to look at this map and sort of pick this apart in a second, extend up the entire vineyard. So not everything, but most of them do extend up the entire vineyard. This is the only Grand Cru vineyard in the Côte Nuit where you will find a white wine. There are only 2 Grand Cru vineyards in all of Burgundy that produce both a red and a white. There's only one producer that produces Musigny Blanc, and that is Comte Georges de Vaugirard. And we're going to talk a little bit more about him. Now, I think this is fascinating to look at this map. This is the vineyard holding. So you might think that most producers will own a contiguous parcel inside of a vineyard, right? We already know that these vineyards are fractured. We already know that multiple owners. You might think that these owners' holdings are contiguous, but that's just not true. So for example, Vaugué owns the parcels of Musigny here that are labeled with a 1. So you can see that these parcels are not all together. He owns this part, he owns this part, he owns this part with this little cutout coming from Domaine Loire, from Bone Romani in the middle here. He owns this part. So you can really see how fractured the ownership of these vineyards are. And this is because you can sell and purchase your individual vineyard holdings in Burgundy. So over time, the Vaugué family has gained more and more land within the Musigny vineyard. So they have all of Petit Musigny, and they have most of what you see here in Grand Musigny as well. Who else do you have here? Favelet, Jadot, they own their plot here. It's not negotiant. Drouhin Larose, Joseph Drouhin, Domaine Loire, coming from Bone Romani, as I mentioned before. Jacques Prieur, we already talked about. Meunier is here as well. All right, I really wanted to make it under an hour today, and I apologize that we didn't, but let me know if you have any questions. Of course, if you have to drop off, please do. I'll send out the recording tomorrow so you can watch it and follow up at your own leisure, all right? So let's just talk quickly about these producers. We don't need to go into great detail because I'm going to send you all of this information. So Comte Georges de Vaugeois, the most important domain in Chambolle-Musigny. The domain dates back to 1450. They are considered to be the top producer in the area. The style is light, there's not a lot of extraction, and usually 100% destem. You're going to see that from most of the producers that we're going to talk about. So they might not think that they need to use the stem to add that spice and that texture here, because they're really focusing on that really light, ethereal palette that we have in these wines. As I mentioned, they're the only producer of Musigny Blanc, a Grand Cru white wine coming from the vineyard of Musigny. And they did not make any Musigny Blanc between 1994, actually, and 2014, technically. So 1993 was the last vintage before the vineyard was replanted. And 2015 was the first vintage of Musigny Blanc after the vineyard was replanted. So this doesn't mean that they didn't do anything with that Chardonnay in between, but the family did not feel that the grapes were mature enough to craft a style of wine that deserved the name Grand Cru Musigny Blanc and Comte Georges de Vaugeois. So they declassified their Grand Cru Musigny Chardonnay to Bourgogne Blanc up until 2014. So during this 22 years. Now, also important to know, Chambolle-Musigny, their village level bottling. The bulk of grape come from Porlotot, with the Premier Cru of Badouet and Les Fouets. So we know that that will have a mineral-driven intensity to it because we know about those Premier Cru vineyards. Really important. Chambolle-Musigny Premier Cru. This is also entirely crafted from younger Pinot Noir vines that are declassified from the Grand Cru Musigny vineyard. So it's a mini Musigny. It's kind of like a second wine if you really had something like that in Burgundy. It has all the class and elegance, if not the weight and intensity that we might find out of Musigny. But it is a mini Musigny. It's their younger vines, usually 25 years and younger, before they become mature enough to use in their Grand Cru Musigny. They also make wine in Amoureuse, supposed to be one of the most wonderful wines that exist from Burgundy. They make wine in the Bonne Grand Cru, as we mentioned, and also, of course, we know about the Musigny Grand Cru wines. Fremieres, founded in 1924, began estate bottling in 1945. So today run by Christophe, who took over from his father in 92, and he really brought a great sense of precision to the wines coming from Chambolle-Musigny. A lot of the vines that they make wine from are rented from family members, so you can have long-term contracts in Burgundy and call that a domain wine. Also traditionally destemmed, but we're seeing a little bit of experimentation with whole clusters, minimal use of new oak, which is also very common within Chambolle-Musigny, maximum of 50% for Grand Cru Bonne Mar. These wines are usually very seductive and fruity in their youth, but they really age well also. So if you're going out to dinner and you really want to buy a bottle of Burgundy and your money is no option, and you're thinking between something a little younger and fresher, you might think about the Fremieres, right? So they're making a village level wine, a Premier Cru Le Cras, Bonne Mar, and Musigny Grand Cru as well. Meunier has been in the area since 1863. So they actually label their wine under the Chateau de Chambolle-Musigny, but the name of the producer is more important in this case. So you can see that they actually list Jacques Frédéric Meunier in larger letters, and then underneath Chateau de Chambolle-Musigny. Making a Chambolle-Musigny village level, mostly declassified from La Plante. Chambolle-Musigny, Les Fouets, they're making Les Amoureuse. The Premier Cru, they're making Grand Cru Bonne Mar and Grand Cru Musigny. They have a lot of really floral bouquets in their styles of wine. They tend to be very harmonious in the way that they're made as well. Guillain Barthold, we talk about Guillain a lot, right? All of those Premier Crus. So her most famous are Beaubruns, Le Cras, and Verrois, which she is a monopole owner of the Premier Cru section of the vineyard of Verrois, but not the village classified area. And I'll explain this in a second if you're like, wait, that's not her. Why is this on here? So Guillain, she shared a facility and also a vineyard team with her husband, but their brands themselves are actually entirely separate. So it's a really wonderful opportunity to see the range of Premier Cru bottling that she does. She does not bottle wine from the Grand Crus, from Musigny or Beaumar. She doesn't own any of those vineyards. So you can see her labels here. And the point that I wanted to make after all of this is when we're looking at these vineyard classification, Les Verrois, so you can see here she's labeled it as Premier Cru, right? So how do you tell this Les Verrois apart from this Les Verrois? Well, this one tells you right here, it's the Premier Cru vineyard. This one has the absence of that term, meaning it's only classified at the village level, because you see the name of the village, you see the name of the vineyard, but you don't see the designation of Premier Cru, right? So always think about that idea. Make sure that you see Premier Cru on the label itself. If you're thinking about the amount of money you want to spend, if it's a gift, if you want to try that Premier Cru. Berthaud is often overlooked, tiny holdings, but really fantastic wine that you can find in the area. It does make wine in Bonma and Amoureuze and Le Charmes, as well as some others. Amiot Cervelle, we mentioned quite a bit. Christian and Elizabeth, husband and wife, an organic estate since 2003. Their style is fresh, it's modern, but as many of the other estates of Chambolle, they don't rely a lot on new oak. You'll keep hearing this. I think it bears repeating because it has a lot to do with the style of the region. Louis Boyau, the partner to Guillain Barthold, not quite as famous as his partner. He's actually descended from the family Boyau coming from Volnay, and he makes a much larger range of wine. So aside from, he lives in Chambolle now, but he also makes wine from Volnay, he makes wine from Pommard, he makes wine from Gevrey. So he makes wine across a much larger area in Burgundy than a lot of the other producers in Chambolle do. Felitig, you're going to be talking about this producer next week with Ryan. You're going to be drinking their Vosne Romani example. Brother and sister Gilbert and Christine. Henry was the son of, or Henri, of a local Italian immigrant, or an Italian immigrant who married a woman coming from Chambolle as well and ended up staying here in the village. They make a Clos les Villages, which is their village level Chambolle-Musigny, showed really beautifully. They're the only producer of Carrier. They produce wine in Fuselot, and then they also create just a village level wine as well. Oudolo Baillet, you'll see them producing wine a little bit up and down the Côte. They're not only located in Chambolle either. Dominique, now Domaine, bottles everything. This is something that's been newer in the last couple of decades as well. Tends to use a little bit more new oak than many of the other producers that we've talked about. And this crafts a style that's a little deeper, a little bit fuller, a little richer. Thank you guys. That was a lot. I feel like I just barely even, I put way too much there. It's a lot to talk about. These classes should be like 2 hours. But thanks for bearing with me. So these wines, I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts or comments about them. I don't even know if you guys are still with me. I certainly hope so. So Joseph Drouhin. So this is a winery that is both a Maison, meaning a negociant, and a Domaine. So you will see labels that state either Maison, that's telling you that they purchased the grapes from somebody else, from a different grower. And then when you see Domaine, it means that they're making wine from grapes in vineyards that they own that parcel of. Founded in Beaune in 1880. Beaune is sort of the village in the Côte de Beaune that's home to a lot of these larger negociant houses. They own some of the most historical cellars of Burgundy. It is a family-run negociant in Domaine, and it's fourth generation. They also make wine in other places in the world, most importantly in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. So they have Domaine Drouhin, Oregon as well. Veronique is the winemaker at Domaine Drouhin, Oregon. She spends a lot of time going back and forth. It's kind of the head winemaker. She has people that live there all year round, of course, to watch the wines. But they own 80 hectares in 90 different appellations, but 2/3 of those are classified as Premier Cru and Grand Cru. So their holdings in these areas in the Côte d'Or are really important. And this is a negociant that epitomizes quality. Oftentimes we think, oh, negociant is no good next to a domain in Burgundy. And that's just not necessarily always true. And also, you know, a negociant can offer you an opportunity to try wines at a price from Grand Crus or Premier Crus that you might not necessarily be able to try from other producers. Like, you know, it'd be much cheaper to drink all of the Montrachet Grand Cru from Diado than from any other producer there as well. So this wine does come from multiple parcels in Chambolle. They're younger vines, an average age of 20 years, but the total area it's coming from is about 1/4 hectare, so pretty small. 14 to 18 months in new wood as well. Now, Digioia-Royer, so this is their lieu-dits, les Fremieres, so the larger, one of the larger lieu-dits village vineyards that you see. And this is old vine. So I'm really excited for you to try two different vintages, one that definitely had some age to it, 17 versus 14, and then sort of a young vine versus old vine. Then the Drouhin should be lifted and pretty and just immensely enjoyable, but maybe it's not piquing your intellect in the same way that the Digioia-Royer is, right? So it's a tiny domain. They have less than 5 hectares of vines, just under 2 in Chambolle, spread across 7 different lieu-dits within the area. The vines for their plots within Fremieres are planted in 1934 and 1935. This is also aged in 20% new wood, French oak, just like the Drouhin as well, which I think is a really cool comparison to try these two wines side by side. Any thoughts? How are we doing, guys?
I don't have them. It's too late, but I didn't have anything from Burgundy, so I just opened Raj Par.
Oh, fun!
A Domaine de la Côte, so that was all I had to kind of follow along. But thanks, it was fun as always.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. I think I just threw a lot at you guys. That was really intense for me. I have to say, but like, wow, I put way too much in these slides. I tend to do that. I get really excited. I spend a lot of time preparing for these classes. So I really do appreciate that you kind of indulge me and you indulge Cork Buzz. And, you know, the point of this was really to create an outline that I can give to you. You'll have that tomorrow. That when you want to look at these different Premier Crus, when you want to see the characteristics of these 2 Grand Crus, that you have that as a reference for later on. There'd be no way that you could ever memorize everything that I just threw at you. I can't memorize everything that I just threw at you off the slide. So I just thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Great to see you. Have a good weekend.
Nice to see you too. Thank you.
Thanks, Amber. I did have a quick question, if you don't mind.
I know if you have any questions.
I know you were saying like the general style here is that the fruit is destemmed and there's little or judicious use of oak. Just sort of as a review, comparing that to Gevrey Chambertin and Moray Saint-Denis, I guess those typically use more oak and they combine both destemmed fruit and fruit with the stems, right? Or
I would say so. When you think about the kind of the main, I guess, you know, we're always thinking about the main producer too. So if you think about like, Dujac is such an important producer in Maurice Saint-Denis, and their style is to not destem, right? They use a lot of whole clusters. And I know when we were talking about the different producers in Gevrey-Chambertin, like a lot of the style for, especially because of the 9 Grand Crus and these different, I mean, a lot of those styles were, 50 to 75 to up to 100% new oak for those styles of wine. And it is interesting because you would think that in Chambolle, the producers might want to include stem to add some texture to the wine, because they do kind of texturally, they don't have the same sort of tannin structure that these other villages do. But I mean, I think it seems to me that they, it's one of the villages that I think really embraces the style of its wine, and it doesn't have as much kind of duplicity as you see in the vineyards as in some of the other villages. So I think that is really kind of the style that's evolved, and they really seem to think showcases the terroir the best. I would say, I haven't seen somebody that says that specifically, but Burgundy can be kind of insular, and they don't always tell you the reasoning for doing everything.
Makes sense. And then just quickly, how does it compare to Vosne Romani? I know we're going to do that next week, but
well, Vosne Romani also, depending on who the producer is. So like DRC also, they don't destem. They use a lot higher proportion of, I mean, maybe not so much higher. I guess I can't remember off the top of my head what the kind of proportion for new oak are, but they also vary from year to year, whether they destem or not based on the condition, but their general style is if the conditions are good enough, they do not destem either. So, and they're, that, 4 of the 6 Grand Crus are monopoles. So one of the interesting things about Vosne Romani is that, is this really a stylistically terroir, or is this stylistically producer, which I think will be really fun. So I'm gonna tell Ryan though to be prepared for the next class, because you're gonna want to know.
Thanks, Amber. And this was great. I love all the details. I definitely need to review this a couple of times, but it's great. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sticking it out with me on a Friday night, guys. Have a good evening. Enjoy your weekend. I'll talk to everybody soon. Thanks.